One of the skills that we have to learn when looking at raw images is to look past the thumbnail as it is and try to see it as it could be. Now, that's going to be a little bit easier said than done, but of course the more we do this, the easier it becomes. Now, we're looking at this thumbnail isolated in Photoshop's bridge, but of course in normal circumstances we may see this amongst a sea of other images, and this one is unlikely to jump out. I think what we need to do is to look at the image and sit back and ask ourselves, what does the image lack? What do we need to do first? And then use the tools of Photoshop to try to deal with those aspects of the manipulation. With this particular image, I think there's potential here, but we have to be able to recognize that in our thumbnails, especially when they're amongst a sea of 100 other thumbnails. It wouldn't be too difficult to bypass this image and miss it completely, or alternatively just put it down as one of our failures. In this video, let's see if we can do something worthwhile live, so to speak. We're going to create our completed image live while recording this video. I think the first thing to mention is how little the color is adding to the image. However, the content and the composition is there, so we're not starting here with a complete basket case. Now, what we're going to be doing here is moving this image from color to monochrome. But I don't think we should make monochrome images just because we're able to do so. We need to ask ourselves the question, why are we going to make this image into a monochrome image? Why not a color image as shot? If we have good reasons for taking the course we're about to take, then generally speaking, the result is going to be better for it. I think this image has three things which make it a worthwhile candidate for a monochrome conversion. First of all, we have the content. We have a gritty power station, and I think anyone can visualize that in monochrome. It's going to need a lot of contrast added into this image, and I think the black and white medium along with the content will work well there too. And of course, the other thing is it's got very little color, and certainly no color that seems to be adding anything positive to the image at all. So we know where we want to start. So let's do just that. I'm going to make a start by just removing the saturation of this image. Next thing is to think about that contrast, but I'm going to be working probably with the sky and the foreground separately. So let's concentrate on the bottom third to start with. Taking a quick glance up at the histogram, but if we're going to be working with the sky independently to the foreground, we can use the histogram as a guide, but we mustn't follow it blindly. For example, if we shot a black cat in a dark corner, we would expect all of the histogram to be stacked up on the left. If we try to spread that histogram, we're going to spoil the image. So when we're going to work in the way I'm going to work here, I use the histogram as a guide only. Perhaps the next place to look would be the clarity. I'm going to give this a very, very healthy slug of clarity. Clarity increases the mid-tone contrast, and you can see an improvement straight away. Maybe though we can also look at the whites. We can see we've got a deficiency up here by moving our cursor into this area, and just below left of the cursor you can see highlights, and there you can see whites. And by the way, we can move the sliders down below, but I can actually click and drag in the histogram itself, and you can see the slider in the highlights moving, and when I move to the whites I can do that too. I tend to prefer to work down here, but you can see I can put a lot of contrast into that foreground, and I'm sort of ignoring what effect I'm going to have on the sky for the moment. Now I'm going to just take a look at lifting the shadows a little bit, maybe a little bit, that's okay. Maybe a little bit more of the whites coming up here just to put a bit more contrast, but that seems to be nice. I don't want to go too far, I don't want to burn out things, but I do want plenty of contrast in the foreground, because once we do the sky, then we're going to need that to be in balance with the sky. Now that doesn't look too bad. I'm not sure if I've got it perfect yet, but it doesn't really matter, because I'm going to take you to the bottom of the screen here in the hyperlink. I've got this option checked, which is to open this as a smart object, which means when I click to open this into Photoshop, it's going to open up as a smart object, meaning I can jump back into Camera Raw as many times as I like and make as many changes as I like. And that's going to be useful as we go through the manipulation. Control 0 will fit the image on screen. If I go to my layers, there you can see the little symbol that tells us we're working on a smart object. And if I go to the right of the thumbnail, right click, I'm going to make a copy. New smart object via copy. What I've done by copying this layer in that way is I've got two smart objects, but the link back to the original now is severed, meaning I can adjust each of these independently of the other. So if I select the one below, let's turn that one off for the moment. If I double click this thumbnail, I can now go back into Camera Raw and make the adjustments here solely for the sky, ignoring the foreground. Now I want plenty of impact and I want contrast, so I'm just going to drop the exposure down here. I'm going to drop the whites down. I'm going to leave the clarity quite high. Let's take the blacks down, add a bit of impact there. I may push the contrast. You can see what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to add lots of power into that sky. And I think I can go even darker. And you'll notice it's a little bit unfortunate that I've got that little light area of cloud there. So perhaps on this particular occasion I'm going to pick up my gradient tool here, or gradient filter, click and drag just down at the top. If you want to lose the bounding box, just touch the V key, double click, that's where we started from. Just going to move the exposure down just to get it nice and dark at the top. May have to do, I don't want to go too far. Oh, I don't know though. Having that nice solid top is going to look pretty good, I think. Okay, I'm going to stop at that point and consider opening this up. But just for a moment, I want to go back to my basic tab. Now I can do that by just touching the H key on the keyboard, which is effectively picking up the hand tool at the top, but you can see it reverts back. I just want access to the icons here, and I'm going to go to this one because I'm just going to step up the luminance. Perhaps it would be a good idea, in fact, if I picked up the zoom, because I was going to suggest, let's double click the zoom tool. I want to bring my sky up to 100%. Now if we look very carefully, you're looking at a slightly compressed video, so you may not be seeing this at the quality I'm seeing it. Little bit of noise in the sky, nothing significant, but a little bit of luminance here just to take the edge off it, not too much. I think I'm happy with that. Control 0. I'm going to have a look at what that looks like by opening this up into Photoshop. Now I'm well aware that we could have made lots of changes using the graduated filter and the filter brush, but I'm working in a slightly different way here. I just find this more convenient, more controllable. So now if I go back to my layers, I should have the best of both worlds. I should have the best of the foreground and the best of the sky. And all we need to do now is to blend the two together. We're never entirely certain if we've got the balance correct, but it's not important at this time because both of these layers are smart objects. Both of these can be opened back up independently into Camera Raw, adjusted as many times as we wish without losing any quality. I'm going to select the top layer and apply a mask. When I do that, the colours in the colour picker over in the bottom of the toolbox defaulted to black and white. I'm going to select the gradient tool here. From the options at the top of the screen, I'm going to select the default, which is linear gradient. And from these drop down options I'm going to go for foreground to transparent, because what I need to do here is to draw a line to tell Photoshop where to start and end the gradient on a mask, which is going to allow the clouds to show through. So I'm going to start fairly well down the picture, I'm going to hold the Shift key to make sure the line is straight. I'll drop down to about that point, and there you can see the instant change in the image, and the balance there I think is just about right. Now sometimes we don't get that gradient quite right. We can always come down further. For example, if I hit Ctrl Z to undo that, I could start a little bit lower and actually drop down a bit more. So don't always settle for the first gradient you apply, because what I'm thinking of doing here is to lift the tones a little bit and lift the tones in the cooling towers to make them stand out from the rest of the picture. Now it goes without saying that as we go through a manipulation like this, we should be saving our work regularly and often, and it also makes sense sometimes to change the name. So I've just saved my layered file as a Photoshop document, calling it 001, so we've always got the chance to drop back to a previous version should the need arise. Now sometimes when we add a gradient, it takes away, let me just turn that bottom layer off, you can see it stretches right the way down into the foreground, so we don't always want the gradient to be absolutely straight. So if I wanted to lift the tones along that area, for example, I can switch to white. I can pick up my brush, and I'm using just basic brushes here, soft edged. I would have my flow probably around about 5% to start with, and I would maybe just brush along that area. See how I'm just lifting the tones, so I'm keeping all of the density that I want in the sky and the cooling towers, but I'm just relieving the pressure in that area where it made it perhaps just a fraction too dark. Now while I've got that dark layer, which is giving me most of my impressive sky, what I can do is use some of that foreground darkness. It's a little bit too dark there, but I don't need to bring all of it through. Remember, we've still got the mask selected. I'm just going to drop the size of my image down just a little bit. I'm using keyboard shortcuts here, Control-Alt-Spacebar. See the brush changes to the zoom minus, so I can just click once. I just want to be able to move my brush in from the corner here. Now I'm going to have to use black, and I want this to be very, very delicate, so I'm going to go down to just 2%, make my brush a little bigger, and you can see what I wanted to do here, just to give that edge a little bit of a hold in, something like that. Now if you go a little bit too far, this is the beauty of working with a mask, and I don't think I have, maybe a little bit in the corner, you can always drop the brush down, switch to white, and just paint over that about 3 times, so we can always get our work nicely balanced. Control-0 again fits the image on screen. I've not changed things significantly here, so I'm quite happy to hit Control-S to save over the previous version. If I take you back to the layers now, I want to raise the tones in the cooling towers a little bit. Now before I do, if I just turn off, if I just hold the Shift key and click the mask to turn it off, you can see I've got a lot of light tones in them, and I think that's going to be a little bit too light for my purposes here. So what I'm going to do is to move forward with this manipulation by amalgamating these 2 layers. And here's a little tip to do that while retaining those smart objects. What I'm going to do is to hold my Alt key while going to the top right of the layers palette and choosing Merge Visible. What Photoshop's done is to take the 2 smart objects that we created and the mask and amalgamate them all into one layer. So now would be a good point to go to our Save options and save this as a slightly different version. I've said this a number of times, so forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but sometimes we do things on an image on Monday which we think looks great, but when we look at the image on Tuesday we wonder what possessed us to do that. It's nice to have a step back to a previous version. Now the reason I wanted to do that is because I want the freedom to be able to make a copy of this particular layer. So I'm going to go to the right here. I'm going to make a copy of that. I don't need the mask here, so I'm going to drop that in the bin. And I'm going to leave it sitting beneath this particular layer. But I can double click this now and open this back up into Camera Raw, because I want more light coming through those cooling towers, but not quite as much as I had. It may be difficult to mask through what I'm looking for. I'm going to push up the contrast. I really want to make the cooling towers dominant, and when we see them a little bit lighter against that dark sky, then perhaps that would do that. Let's click OK to open that up. And once we do, we then need to place a mask alongside this image here, because we need to bring the lighter tones of the cooling towers through using the mask. But we've got a situation here where we can have our cake and we can eat it too, because if I've got this layer wrong, it's on a smart object. I can change it as many times as I wish. So for this next stage, we need a little care. We need to zoom in. Let me zoom in to just that one to start with. I need my soft edge brush, but not quite that big. And I need black as my foreground color. There's my brush. There's my flow rate. I'm going to push my flow rate to about 10%. Maybe the brush is a bit on the big side, and from this down here I'm going to start to mask this through. Now as soon as I start to do that, a few concerns are beginning to raise their awareness in my brain, because I think I may have that a little bit too light beneath, but we'll wait and see. Now it's tempting to push the flow rate of the tool up even higher, and you're going to need to push the image up large, and you may need to go right along the edge. Now I've got that nice little technique which I've mentioned many times, which is the shift click. I'm going to push my flow rate up to about 50% now, and I'm using the shift click where I click, hold the shift key, click a little further down, and I can mask between 2 points. And it enables me to go along this edge quite comfortably. But of course we've got a mask here, so it doesn't really matter, does it? Even if we go over the edge. And down the other side, taking care not to overspill into the sky. And all the way down. Then of course I can make my brush a little bit bigger, and I can fill in the center part and make it look sweet. Don't worry too much if this is too light, as I said a few moments ago. We can temper that in a moment. First thing I'm doing, I'm rushing here a little bit, and you can see I've got a little bit of an overspill creeping in at the top. These sorts of things are going to happen, and I've lightened the steam there too much anyway. So switch to white, drop the brush down, drop the flow rate down, and you can just temper these back. That's a little bit too high, so I'll go down to 2% and do the work with that just gently. And even at the top of the tower we can even bring the density down a little bit. You can see it just changing there, but we need to take a bit of care here. Control 0. When we zoom out we can see that the lightness of the cooling tower is a little bit too much, and here is why we've got so much benefit with that smart object. I'll double click. Just make a mental note, -150. I'm just going to drop it down a bit more and take a look at how it looks when it pops on screen. See what I mean? It's just looking about right now. Just nicely balanced. Now I've got to do all of those cooling towers. Now once we've done one and you've seen the technique, then I don't think I need to go through absolutely every single one. But just to remind you of that technique, get the image large, select the mask, drop your brush size down to something like that. Make sure you've got black as your foreground color. I've just hit the X key to do that. The flow rate, well, let me push that up to about 50% like I did before. Click, move a short distance, click, click. So you see the masking now is not quite as marked as it was before, because I've tempered the lightness in the cooling towers, but you can see a bit more of that as it comes up here. You'll notice I go right across the top, knowing that it's going to overdo things for that piece of cloud there, but I don't worry too much about that, because I sometimes find with masking that it's a great thing to mask an area and then actually work backwards. In other words, you sort of almost overmask the area, then you can temper what you see. Sometimes that works a lot better. I'll hit Control 0 and zoom in less close so you can see the rest of this done a little bit quick and dirty. You have to be a bit careful with soft edge brushes when you've got this sort of size on screen. It's dead easy for me to go too close to the edge and then you leave that little halo. But there you can see the second one of these cooling towers done while I've been speaking, although I am rushing just a little bit. And of course, what I meant earlier on about changing to white and tempering the effect, drop the flow rate down. Remember, we dropped it right down. Now you can just temper that little bit of steam so that when you zoom out, everything looks right. Now, as you can see, I've gone ahead and done the rest of those cooling towers, taking just a bit of care, but not too difficult to achieve. I've also resaved this as a version 3, so I've got all of my layers safe. But I'm going to take advantage, I think, of the lighter tones beneath, just a little bit, by making sure my mask is still selected, by maybe zooming in at the top here, and I'm just going to make my brush very small. I've got a very low 1% flow, black as my foreground colour. Just going to lift the lighter tones here. Let's go to 2%. I think I can manage 2% without it running away with me. Now you may think that these are very small areas to be adjusted, but sometimes smallest amounts of work can have the biggest impact. And I thought I may look and see if I could just lift the tones a little bit. What we're doing, we're separating the whites and the blacks a little bit in a couple of strategic places. Let's hit Control 0. There's one up there maybe. But I don't want to go too far, so we notice that we've been at work here. Just a little bit of extra light through these areas maybe. And you would work a little bit more carefully than me with your image much greater, and perhaps back at that 1% flow. 2% is almost too much, so it just demonstrates how careful we have to be. But at this point, Control S will save over the top of my previously saved version, so I've got every bit of work that I've done safely stored. But I want to move on. And I'm going to take a bit of pressure off my computer now. I'm pretty certain that I don't want to go back into Camera Raw. So what I'm going to do is to move on from this point, and I'm going to go to the top right here and choose to flatten the image. And before I go any further, to make sure I don't make a mistake and overwrite my third version, I'll make this my fourth. So once again, belt and braces all the way. What I'm going to do next is to deal with the distractions in the image, and there's a few of those. I'm going to start with this one down here. It's a direction indicator for people on the river. That's going to have to go. Let's drop the size down a little bit, and I think we can use content aware to achieve that. I think I'll pick up my rectangular marquee. I'll just draw around that down to that sort of position. Now I'm going to hit the delete key. I've got a locked layer here. Because I flattened this layer, I can use the delete key. But if it wasn't a locked layer, if I use the delete key, I'd just cut a hole in the picture. In that case, use your edit fill. But I'm just going to hit the delete key. The content aware fill box appears. You can see that's selected here. Click OK. What a great repair. Control D will remove that. Control 0, that's that one dealt with. Let's have a look at this one up here. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Another sign by the look of it. So again, I think content aware will deal with this too. Delete, enter, And that one's done. Will it deal with this one as well? Looks like a big gas cylinder. Delete, enter. Yes, that's good enough. And we've got lots of little highlights around here. Well, let's just switch tools for a moment, and I'll switch to my spot healing brush. If you're a bit unsure about using clone tools or healing brushes, then the thing to do is to add a new blank layer over the top of the image, so you're cloning onto there from here. Just make sure you tick the box sample all layers. So for example, if I zoom in over on the left here, there's a little area there which I would find a little bit distracting. There's that upright, so I'll just click, shift click and get rid of that. Needs another couple of touches. Move along, there's another one. And all these are signs, I think, and they're a real pain where signs are put in places that photographers have to avoid or remove. That looks pretty good. Couple of little white marks there. Now this one I think needs to go, so I'll move that away from there, but you can see what's happened. It's taken away the bar. Is anyone going to notice that? No, of course they're not. But you know, given attention to detail, we can fix these things. Switch to your clone tool, drop the brush down. Remember, we're working on a new blank layer, so we do need to select current and below. So we're actually cloning from the layer with all of the, whoops, let's hold the Alt key and sample. We're cloning from the layer with all the detail on it onto the one above, so I can replace that little bit fairly easily. Now let's go back to my spot healing brush and move along. Now we can get too carried away with this, but attention to detail is a good thing. So any areas that are a bit of a giveaway, sometimes it's best to zoom out like that and look for them. There's some over on the right. Now we don't often realize how much damage some of these highlights do until we actually can remove many of them, and then perhaps look at a quick before and after by turning the layer off. And they can be more damaging than we really appreciate. Now I'm just about to suggest that we amalgamate those two layers, but there is something in the background here. It looks like a bird caught flying or a bug, I don't know, but whatever it is, it has to go. So now we can go back to layers, and perhaps we can flatten those two. And what we're going to do next, because we've put two layers together, or more than two actually, I'm just going to take one look at the levels just to have a look and see how it all balances overall. Control L. Now that doesn't look too bad, but maybe I can see, I don't want to burn anything out, but a little bit more sparkle. Just a little bit, every little helps. So we've got now all of the tones nicely balanced. Now what I'm also going to suggest is perhaps we do just a little work on those uprights. Maybe they are a little bit on the bright side, and because we've now got this far into our manipulation, I'm going to choose burn. I'm going to pick a brush about that size, all soft edge brushes. I'll go to my highlights, 6% exposure, that should be okay. I'm just going to move my brush over that just to kill it a little bit. I think I can push it up a bit higher to 10%. You can see the tones just dropping down marginally. We don't want to go too far so that the work we're doing can be spotted. And once again, feel free to get your image much larger than mine and take a bit more care. I am going a little bit quick to not make this video any longer than it needs to be. But you can see just taking the edge off of these, not much, because if you go too far you could leave them a little bit of a grey smudge. I think that's all we need. If you've got any areas that you think need a little touch, then you can do that too. The other thing I was thinking of is the foliage down in the foreground and the meadow in the middle distance. So maybe if I used the dodge tool and maybe had the mid-tones selected, see here I'm just lifting that, and that's going to draw our attention up in that sort of area. And maybe even a little bit down there with those lighter tones to give even a little bit more sparkle with the contrast. Now, sometimes when you're doing a lengthy piece of work like this, there comes a time when perhaps it's a good idea to put down the mouse or the graphics tablet pen, sit back in your chair and just have a 2-minute time out. It's just taking that few minutes to have a look and make sure we've got things just as we want them before we move on. Well, I'm going to do a couple of things I think to finish this image off. First thing I'm going to do is to give it a little bit more of a panoramic look. We've already got, I think, pretty good composition here. When we click in, you can see we've got a nice strong position for the cooling towers, and that's one of the reasons really why we've spent a bit of time raising the tones of those, because they're compositionally strong and an interesting shape as well. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give it a bit more of a panoramic shape simply by stretching the image. Image size. I'm going to look at this as pixels, 5616, perhaps inches. So I've got the chain link here, which normally is linked, unlinked, so I can adjust the width without touching the height. I'm going to call that 19. So I'm going to go to 20, 21, maybe 20 3/4, 20 1/2. Let's go for it. Let's go for 21 inches. Click OK. And you can see exactly what's happened. I've looked at the images many times to make sure that that slight change doesn't affect the quality, and I've yet to see any detrimental effects. Next thing I think is to pick up my freehand lasso tool, and I'm just going to make a freehand lasso shape around that sort of area, and I need to inverse that. We can do that from the select menu, but there is a shortcut, Control-Shift-I, and then select and mask. I've got the black and white options selected here, but you can look at this in a number of different ways. How we look at it is not entirely vital here. I need my feather up quite high, usually around the 300, 350, so I'm just going to dial it in and click OK. I'll hide the selection, Control H, and I'm going to bring up my levels just to tweak the edges down just a little more. I don't want to go too far so we can see we've been at work. I just want to go down as far as I dare so that if we tick the preview button, we can see that it's quite a nice thing to have, but without going too far. And when I'm happy with that, I'll click OK, not forgetting I've got a hidden selection, so Control D will remove that. So there we have our completed monochrome image. Before we bring this video to a close, I'd like to look at a couple of derivatives. I've already saved this as a Photoshop file, as a completed image. I'm going to make a change by adding a sepia tone and also a blue tone. The blue tone I think may work pretty well because blue seems to work well with winter landscapes. This certainly was a winter landscape, and again I think a pale blue would work quite well with the content. We'll try the sepia tone first. If we go to Image, Adjustments and our Hue and Saturation, we can do this via adjustment layers if you wish, but at this stage I'm quite happy to tick the colorize box. About 24 in the hue, and anything with the saturation from about 6 upwards. In this case that looks a little too warm for reasons I'm not too sure, so let's drop to 4. And there we have a very delicate sepia tone. Now going back to the monochrome, I'm going to go to my Control U, the Hue and Saturation again, tick the colorize box. I'll leave the saturation nice and high, but I want to bring this slider along to the blue. I like the saturation up high here so I can get the right blue, because if it goes slightly too far it goes mauve. I like to have the deepest blue I can get but without going mauve, so it's somewhere around 222, 224. Then we can just drop the saturation down till we get that just cool black and white. Now remember, back in the darkroom days we would use tones for these, but you could actually purchase black and white printing paper with a more cooler black and white for just these sorts of jobs. Now, what I'm about to do here is not a very fair thing to do. I'm going to compare our starting image with the three we've created. But it isn't a fair comparison because we shot this image in RAW, and the whole purpose of RAW is telling the camera to do nothing with the image, to leave it to us. So RAW files are meant to be adjusted quite a bit. But nevertheless, it's nice to look at the before and after, and also our sepia tone, and that works quite well as long as we keep it delicate. But I think the blue tone may also work pretty well too. Let's go back to the starting image and the blue tone. Well, you pays your money and you takes your choice. When I create a number of versions of a completed image like this, and I'll take you back into Bridge, there's the black and white sepia and the blue tone, sometimes it's difficult to make our mind up which one we like best. I find it's best to keep all three anyway, but even if you didn't want to keep them forever, all three together, keep them like that for a few days and just look at what you've done a few times, tomorrow, day after, and you'll find that the strongest image generally finds its way to the foreground.